Good morning and welcome to the Eclectic Radical. As always, I'm Chris Richards, the Eclectic Radical. Joining me today are my friend and colleague Youri Smouter of the 1+1 program here on YouTube. How are you doing today, Youri?
Doing great, and really looking forward to the topic we're going to be discussing. It's something that really fascinates me. It's something that I've actually explored on the program before, but never when it comes to how we're going to be approaching it. So thanks again for the invitation.
My pleasure. And also joining us is Democratic Party strategist and former co-chair of the West Virginia Democratic Party Indigenous Caucus, Seth Sturm. How are you doing today, Seth? Seth, are you okay?
Oh, yeah. Can you hear me now? Sorry about that.
I can hear you now. It seemed like we were mute for a moment. You were muted.
I think I was. Thank you for having me here today. I'm excited. Always want to point out it's the now defunct Indigenous Caucus for the West Virginia Democrats. They will not start a new one.
It's worth mentioning.
But thanks for having me. Yeah, great to be
My
here.
pleasure. But that's why I said former co-chair, because the caucus doesn't exist anymore. Now, so the topic today is propaganda and how cops influence our media. And while we're going to talk about a lot of the stuff you expect us to talk about too, I want to start with what's referred to these days as the Los Angeles PD Media Office, which has a great deal of influence on a lot of product, both in television and in Hollywood. A young cop named Gene Roddenberry got a job with the media office as a speechwriter for then LAPD police chief Bill. I can't remember his name right now, which is so annoying. He's the guy who invented racial profiling. Bill Parker. That's him, Bill Parker. So Gene Roddenberry was a speechwriter for the original bad cop of Los Angeles, Wild Bill Parker. And he got it, and through this position, and through his job in the media office, he also got a job as the police technical consultant on a show called Mr. District Attorney. And he went from being the police technical consultant on Mr. District Attorney to submitting scripts to the production staff of Mr. District Attorney and finding his stuff on TV. So the technical consultant became a TV writer. And he started writing pilots for his own TV show. Now, everybody knows Star Trek. That's the one that was successful in the end. His first pilot, however, was for a police anthology show called Police Story, which was coincidentally similar to another police anthology show called Police Story. The pilot was written by Joseph Wambaugh in the 70s, which actually did sell and end up on TV. So Gene Roddenberry was trying to make this show in the 60s, and it didn't work. And so they came back to it in the 70s with a different cop turned writer.
Wow. Unbelievable.
Now, the reason that I bring this up is because we don't necessarily think of Star Trek as propaganda. But it's worth noting that the guy who created Star Trek came out of the media office. And that's why even though there's lots of great socialist stuff in Star Trek, you also keep seeing the USS Enterprise play cop. Now, his second pilot, which did sell and which ended up on TV for a season before it was canceled, was a military show called The Lieutenant. Now, keep in mind that this was while we still had people stationed in Korea, even though the war was already on pause. We hadn't really amped up in Vietnam yet, but we had people in Vietnam. So Gene Gene Roddenberry does a show about a U.S. Army lieutenant played by Gary Lockwood trying to run his platoon on a U.S. Army base in the U.S. Now, there were some good things in the lieutenant. The lieutenant starred Nichelle Nichols as the wife of one of the enlisted men in the platoon, and she did really good work on the show. And the show actually did a lot of good conversations about civil rights in the U.S. Army, but it's still a pro-U.S. Army TV show about liberalism in the U.S. in the empire.
Thought so.
And this was on TV for about a season before it got canceled. And that was his second pilot and his first actual TV show on the air himself. So imperialist propaganda. And then Star Trek sells. And Star Trek is definitely in a different direction in some ways, but in the end, you have guys in uniform enforcing street justice in deep space. And for all the good stuff in Star Trek, in the end, it's still the cops who decide what's right and what's wrong. And I think that's even more useful to talk about than some of the actual examples of more blatant propaganda, is how there is a general trend in American media to support the fascist idea that it's okay for the cop to make the final decision about what's right and what's wrong. And even something as optimistic and socialist as Star Trek can't completely get away from that idea. What do you think about that, Seth?
I'm not a big Star Trek guy. I don't think I've ever watched a full episode. I'm going to be honest. But I will say this. What you're saying resonates with me because it makes a lot of sense. You nailed it, because that is, I think a lot of storytelling comes from, where people come from. So if Roddenberry's idea or ideology is one that supports this notion of good police, good military, that we're doing things on a righteous cause, then, even if you have these socialist ideals that you espouse, there's still part of you that believes that's going to be upheld through similar systems to what we have now, because you believe in those systems. And I think that's reflective of the creators. Like a lot of this propaganda stuff, when I'm looking at it, I see things popping up in stories. I know you and I have talked about The Wire before, Chris.
Yes.
The Wire is one where there doesn't seem to have been any input whatsoever from, Baltimore police or any police department, but there are still these elements within the storytelling that show up that just come through osmosis of who the creators are. Even if you're trying to subvert those ideas, some of it's going to creep in possibly. And I think that's a cultural thing.
I'm glad you mentioned The Wire, because that's a good second. That's an open cop show, of course. So it's back on our topic. And it also sort of suggests that, cops aren't always good people. They break the rules and they do things they're not supposed to do. But it also suggests that they break the rules and that they do things they're not supposed to do because they're frustrated with a system that doesn't let them go after the bad guys. And they know who the bad guys are. They just need to be given a free hand to go after them. And in The Wire, the cops actually end up getting themselves in trouble and getting fired or facing internal affairs investigations at the end of the show because they went too far. But it then shows the sort of system of justice stepping in and working and say, no, you guys went too far. You're all in trouble now. And that sort of feeds into the idea that, well, if they go too far, the system will reprimand them. And Youri, is that always how it really works?
Well, I have to be honest. I'm very glad she brought up Simon and The Wire, because he basically was an embedded journalist for the police and for
yes. He's an embedded journalist with the cops as a crime reporter in Baltimore.
The Baltimore Sun, actually, to be honest. But I'm glad you brought his name up, because although I've not seen The Wire, I saw a mini series he did about an actual police scandal
We Own the Night.
In his hometown of Baltimore called "We Own This City." Now,
Yeah.
Simon is on records, and in this mini series, he's very clear about his opposition to the drug war and
Yes.
broken window policing and so forth like that. And I actually would recommend that people actually watch that mini series rather than The Wire, because many people said that The Wire has that's very mixed bag and very.
I'm glad you mentioned We Own the Night. I really am, because David Simon is an example of the guy who thinks that he's fighting against propaganda, and he ends up reinforcing it. I have had one of the guests I have had on this show before is Justine Barron, who is a crime reporter in Baltimore who has written about a police murder that is central to We Own the Night. And despite claiming to be against the bad things the Baltimore PD does and a voice for sanity, David Simon ends up whitewashing the official police story that this victim of a police murder killed himself.
In fact, and that's actually a perfect segue. Now, because talking about propaganda and going on what you were saying, I actually prepared something. So one of the most persistent police propagandas that's often featured in films and TVs that explore police corruption and so forth. And one of the excuse for why police corruption is so rampant, why the police are so prone to corruption and looking the other way when the police officer is abusing its power and engaging in intolerable racism, queerphobia, sexism, etc., is the following. And again, it's in films that highlight police corruption. So again, in these films, supposedly critical and denouncing police corruption, the propaganda is the following. The police are working class whose jobs and the risks they take in upholding law and order are constantly overlooked and undervalued, unlike the U.S. military, where after your service you get free healthcare, free high school, free higher education, and free mental health care and disability benefits. So the argument is, if the police were simply paid more of a living wage, then police wouldn't be so prone to corruption. And the following films that more or less argue this line of thinking are the following: Harsh Times, written and directed by David Ayer; Street Kings, directed by David Ayer; To a Degree, Training Day and End of Watch, both written by David Ayer; Bright, again, written and directed by David Ayer; The Shield, 21 Bridges, directed by Brian Kirk, starring Chadwick Boseman in one of his last films before his death; the British TV police crime drama The Responder, starring Martin Freeman; Bulletproof, which is a much more lighthearted comedy drama buddy cop TV series starring Noah Clarke and Ashley Walters. One of the higher-ups gets involved in some corruption and stealing of money, and the rationale was this poor police officer isn't paid enough to take care of her needy elderly mother. So,
and to that, I respond, everybody needs to watch the only American anti-propaganda cop show, which is called Life. It lasted 2 seasons. It was messed up by a Hollywood writers' strike. It starred Damian Lewis pretending to be an American and coming off very well, just like in Band of Brothers, and the guy who played Bigfoot on Northern Exposure, whose name I can't remember right now, Adam. Why can't I remember his name? Just a sec.
Well, while you're searching for that, and then another movie which also promotes this idea is Colors, starring that douchebag Sean Penn and Robert Duvall, also pushes this line. And the worst propaganda and probably the dumbest liberal take on police brutality and so forth, and just normalizes the impunity of the police, is The Hate U Give. And of course, look, several adaptations of Batman have also pushed this, including Batman: The Dark Knight with Heath Ledger's great performance as the Joker.
Adam Arkin. That's his name. Adam Arkin.
Practically all the police are corrupt and can't be trusted. And when Harvey Dent Two-Face confronts one that you think is one of the good cops, she cries, "I'm sorry, I needed the money desperately. My mom needed the care."
Well, so, and there's a whole thing in the United States where even people who are really well off need the money because their families need the care because insurance companies won't pay for it, and you end up having to have cash. And even a lot of well-off families aren't really set up to handle a $2,000 unexpected expense. But all of that aside, the thing about life is it shows that cops are actually petty bourgeois business people. The central murder for which the main character is sent to prison is the murder of his partner. They run a bar together when he's not a cop. So cops are business owners. Cops have access to capital and are in partnership with civilians who find it easier to do business with a cop as a partner, especially in things like bars, nightclubs, strip clubs. It's so much easier to get a liquor license if your partner's a cop.
Wait. Is that true, or is that or is
no?
That
that's totally a thing. I mean, so in Los Angeles, which is where life is set, the LAPD is the central protagonist and villain of the story. The cops really are very plugged into the local petty bourgeois for the simple reason that if you're in almost any kind of business that requires a license, it's so much easier to get a license if your partner's a cop.
That kind of reminds me of the title of William Black, who prosecuted the Keating, what was that scandal called? The
Keating 5, the savings and loan scandal, and the senators taking bribes to deregulate savings and loans.
Exactly, and William Black, who covered the financial crisis and the corruption behind the subprime mortgage scandals. So, the title of his book is "The Best Way to Rob a Bank is to Own It." And I think, and well, Margaret Kimberly.
There's a possibly apocryphal why can't I remember? There's a possibly apocryphal Willie Sutton quote that I think suits John Dillinger more because Willie Sutton never actually loaded his guns. They were always empty. But Willie Sutton or John Dillinger or whoever it was allegedly said, if you give a man a gun, he can rob a bank. If you give a man a bank, he can rob the world.
And to paraphrase that, when it comes to the police and propaganda, and this whole line that the police are these, the police are working class and they just need to be given a living wage, and then they won't become prone to corruption. Margaret Kimberly, I think, said it best when she was pushing back against that argument, and when she was explaining to me and my audience that the police are paid very well,
and the police.
She said that the perfect crime is to actually be a police officer.
And the police are actually part of the cultural corruption of the bourgeois, because the police are part of the bourgeois, even if only the petty bourgeois. They own businesses. They have access to capital. It's much easier to get a loan if you're a cop. It's much easier to get various side jobs as a security consultant if you're a cop. There are all sorts of business opportunities that are specifically opened up by being in law enforcement that people who are not in law enforcement do not have access to. What do you think about that, Seth?
Yeah, I mean, I absolutely agree with that. Clearly, I was just listening to you guys go because that's a lot of great information you're putting out there. One thing, you were talking about life with Damian Lewis, and it's crazy to me that you're saying this is the best anti-propaganda show when he went on to do Homeland, which is
such a propaganda spy show, right?
Right.
I know, it's terrible. It's terrible because that's so disappointing after life. Maybe if he, as the guy who had been brainwashed, had ended up being the sympathetic anti-hero instead of somebody who eventually gets killed off.
Right. Yeah, I mean, it's devastating in that regard. But this idea of cops having more opportunities than others is so true. Many years ago, when I was coming out of high school, I was thinking, what am I going to do with my life? And one of the things that I thought about was I would like to be a private investigator. And what do you have to go through to do that? And it's, school, all these things that you have to jump through. And in a lot of states, you have to work for, do all these things. But one of the, bypasses in many states is just being a police officer for X amount of years. And you can just go sign up for your license. Boom. Well, and, that's just one instance, one example of something that I've experienced, but it's true.
I am very interested in crime fiction, especially PI fiction that cast the cops as maybe not so great. So I've looked into this same area. There is a requirement for being a for being licensed as a private investigator in most states that requires logging so many hours of investigative work. The only way you can log that many hours of investigative work is to, 1, work for a PI, or 2, be a cop.
But then, oh my gosh, Seth, that's so interesting what you're saying. Now, if we were to, I'm very open to the idea of police abolitionism. Once upon a time, I would have thought that it was crazy, but having spoken to a lot of police abolitionists, I am growing more and more open to the idea. I just think we have two completely different ways of approaching it. I think the way to sort of get to a police-free world is community control over the police. Now, apparently, most of what is given to the police's overinflated budgets does not go into solving serial crimes, helping victims of of spousal abuse, of which the police are number one participants of that. So I always wonder, okay, so if we were to radically defund the police and only give the money, strictly only give the money to find serial killers, would that basically be, great for people who actually want to be private investigators and actually do want to, solve cold cases and people who are victims of murder and they're still trying to find the killers, but the police are so grossly incompetent and are spending more times doing broken windows policing, neo-Dickensian stuff. So I'm curious. Yeah, so Seth, I'm curious your response on that.
So fun fact, since we're talking about police budgets, 97% of most police budgets in the United States go to pay police salaries. Now, I want to be really clear about that. When we talk about what we're spending money on regarding the cops and whether or not how well they're being paid, 90%, more than 90%, in some cases as high as 97, on the low end like 95 to 97% of police budgets are spent on cop salaries and administration costs, like civilian salaries for people who work for the cops but aren't cops.
Unbelievable.
So that's what we're spending the money on. We're spending the money on paying the cops. So when people talk about not paying the cops enough, 97% of all police operating costs go to pay the cops.
Well, and I have a question here. Is there something here? So this is what I'm thinking about. There's the reality of like, okay, if someone gets murdered, you probably want to find out who murdered that person, right? But that's
In
where a lot of
theory,
propaganda shows come in, right? They say this
yes,
is the main policing that's done, and when we do it, the people we arrest, they look like everybody. They can be a rich white guy, they can be this affluent person. We don't care because it's justice. But in reality, the vast majority of what policing is about has nothing to do
yes.
with investigating those types of crimes or getting that kind of justice, but that's disproportionately the entertainment.
The lie of the so-called police procedural, which purports to show you an accurate and scientific way that the cops do their job, but ends up revolving entirely around investigation of murders, which is like 3% of actual police work.
And it's universally like everybody accepts you probably want to investigate murders. Like that's
yes, everybody does, but it's these, and it starts out even before novels. There are TV shows and movies about this. But in the 1950s, and this is where it really, really begins, and other people do it. Two people start writing in the 1950s from very different directions. A woman named Elizabeth Linnington, who is published under various names, Del Shannon, Leslie Egan, Egan O'Neill, a few other names, starts publishing books about a really nice, helpful, friendly LAPD lieutenant who spends all his time being nice to his neighbors and solving murders. Doesn't do anything else. He's nice to people and he solves murders. Have we noticed the immediate propaganda there? He's nice to people and he solves murders, and that's his whole life. So that's number one. And in this period in the 1940s, early 1950s, she creates this fantasy world across several different titles starring several different fictional detectives, in which the LAPD of the late 40s and early 50s are these friendly, smiling, nice guys who are out to take care of the people in the safest and best city in the whole country. Now, keep in mind that this is the late 1940s, early 1950s LAPD that was doing the most corrupt and brutal things in the history of American policing outside of the FBI and the Pinkertons. So her books set a tone. Now, from the other direction, a man named Evan Hunter, who is best known under his real name for a book called The Blackboard Jungle that became a very good movie about teaching in inner city high schools, also began writing under the name Ed McBain a series of police procedurals called the 87th Precinct. Now, the 87th Precinct covered a lot more crimes than just murder, which is really important. It showed that cops weren't just investigating murders. And it came from a very liberal point of view, saying that a lot of people who are criminals are actually decent people who are caught up in a bad system and end up being abused by that system and don't have much other choice but to continue to be criminals unless society steps in and gives them another chance. And he advocates for the idea of society and the cops actively working to rehabilitate these people who really want another chance. And he has bad things happen to these people in the course of his stories because our society doesn't sufficiently support giving people another chance. But he also tends to blame our society not giving people another chance on the bad people. And he tends to buy into a lot of conservative arguments about how we need to handle the bad people that he doesn't seem to understand reinforce how we treat the good people who deserve another chance.
Well, and I think it's interesting what you were talking about with with the women propaganda. Given, it was in 1928, there was the Wineville chicken coop murders and the scandals that unfolded, in which the woman who was looking for her missing son, who definitely was one of the victims of this brutal serial killer who kidnapped children and brutally murdered them and fed them to his pigs and so forth like that. And the cops claimed that they found her son. It clearly wasn't her son. And when she kept complaining about that, the police put her in a mental institution. And this was also at the time where the police where the LAPD itself was engaged in so many, scandals where they themselves literally were a gang. They themselves literally were involved in organized crime and so forth. And
well, since Connor, who has been on the show himself quite a bit, since Connor mentions the Zoot Suit riots, this is a great place to cut into another insidious sort of propaganda that sort of purports to tell the truth about the police, but then says, but this is how it is, and there's not anything we can do about it, which is the works along the lines of LA Confidential. When it comes to the book, LA Confidential by James Elroy, the Zoot Suit riots of 1943 sort of cut into the background of the story. The central character and his corrupt partner, whose murder is being investigated in the course of the story, both beat up the Zoot Suit rioters. The Zoot Suit riots were a police riot targeting working class Mexican men in Los Angeles in 1943, and there were a lot of other things going on, and it's a horrific example of racism from the LAPD. It's also about disciplining the working class and not allowing people to display any sort of cultural solidarity or freedom in the face of police repression. But the Zoot Suit riots are part of the background of LA Confidential, which is, it's important to understand that the other central protagonist of LA Confidential, the quote-unquote good guy, is a police lieutenant who is given the nickname Shotgun Ed Exley after essentially committing the judicial murder of two black men whom he mistakenly believes to have committed a robbery and murder called the Night Owl murders. Which really, the Night Owl murders really happened. And I encourage everyone to Google them. The Night Owl murders are the central case that starts everything in LA Confidential. Trying to apprehend the Night Owl murderers is what makes Shotgun Ed Exley a hero and a detective lieutenant in homicide. And so the good guy in this horrific story is a guy who murdered two innocent black men because he thought they committed a murder. And while this may not openly seem like propaganda, in the end, Shotgun Ed Exley in both the book and the movie is the closest thing to a hero.
Speaking of propaganda, and this gets into FBI territory. One of the biggest criticisms that the film Burning Mississippi with Gene Hackman,
Mississippi Burning, yes, Willem Dafoe.
Rest in peace, though, to Gene Hackman and Willem Dafoe. One of the big criticisms. And even Howard Zinn, the late great Howard Zinn, felt the need to talk about this, was that the FBI, if not for the FBI sending their good apples into Mississippi, they would have never broken up the Ku Klux Klan and gone after the perpetrators of the folks that killed the two white Jewish people and their black friends who were trying to desegregate, who were engaged in trying to desegregate busing and so forth like that. Now, anybody who does basic research, basic 101 research into the FBI knows that give us a fucking break. J. Edgar Hoover was a white supremacist state terrorist who went after every single people power movement, from Martin Luther King Jr. to Malcolm X to Marcus Garvey to the Black Panthers to the American Indian movement
and
to
the
actual
case
with COINTELPRO. J. Edgar Hoover,
actual case was broken. The actual case was broken, and the FBI didn't have any choice but to do anything because of the work of black communist journalists whose work ended up getting into the white press and getting white press attention for what happened. It also did not hurt that one of the cops central to the murder was an open bad apple who had been involved in a really horrible racial murder in which he shot a black World War II veteran in uniform in his car and also killed a white woman sitting in the car with him because they were sitting in the car together with the black man in uniform and a white woman in the passenger seat.
Yeah, no, unbelievable. And in fact, there's always
and this guy was still on the police force in Philadelphia, Mississippi, years later to commit the central murder in that Mississippi Burning movie.
And there's often this argument that the police that we need the police as a necessary evil. Yes, they engage in racism and sexism and queerphobia, but we still need the police for two reasons. We need them to fight organized crime, and we need them to go after the serial killers. Well,
and yet, if you've seen Mississippi Burning, you notice the cops are the murderers.
Well, but not only that. No, but not only that, but this is important because when organized crime was really, really starting to when organized crime was really starting to develop, and of course, this was because of stupid decisions like prohibitionists. J. Edgar Hoover, he was told that organized crime is rising and rising, and he purposely did not go after organized crime. He thought going after black power groups, going after communist movements, going after the working class and keeping them in line was much more important. But also, Meyer Lansky, because of sexual blackmail, had evidence that J. Edgar Hoover was a cross-dresser. So J. Edgar Hoover, since
you mentioned organized crime
of the five families, what became the modern day five families, the Chicago outfit and whatnot.
And J. Edgar Hoover specifically ignored the mafia in order to focus on bank robbers like John Dillinger and Willie Sutton.
That's because he frequented the very gambling facilities.
Here's the big thing. Here's the big thing you have to understand about both the Prohibition era and the Depression just after it. Because of the Prohibition era and their monopoly on booze, during the Prohibition era, the mob had a monopoly on gay bars. Now, because the mob had a monopoly on gay bars, there was a lot of criminal activity that circled around gay bars that had nothing to do with the gay people who frequented the bars, but was rather associated with the mob that owned the gay bar.
Interesting. I did not know that.
The selling of drugs, the facilitating of finding the right partner for people who don't just want to date and would rather pay to meet somebody. All the expected vice stuff that the petty bourgeois both looks down their nose at the working class for indulging in, but also profits off of.
Unbelievable.
Because it's the very guys. I mean, this is the thing you have to understand. The very guy in the Chamber of Commerce advocating for an online porn ban owns the liquor store that sells the Hustler.
Fascinating.
You have to think about that.
The plot thickens. Wow.
I mean, when you're talking about the Chamber of Commerce and your local gentry and bourgeois and petty bourgeois, you got to think about that. The guy who's advocating for the porn ban is the guy who sells the Hustler in his liquor store.
And, and then also, when we talk about, that the police are a necessary evil because of the serial killers, I just have to bring up my greatest lists of when the police spectacularly...
Well, my favorite, I'll cut in, my favorite, just to start us off, the Golden State Killer was a cop.
Okay, before you expand on that, because you do have to talk about that, okay, mine are the following. John Wayne Gacy, when many boys of all ages, by the way, were being kidnapped and disappeared. Yes, some of them were gay, and the response of the police towards all of the people who kept saying, my son's disappeared, my friend's disappeared, was, well, if they're going to this gay place, well, nothing I can do about that. And John Wayne so that was the case of John Wayne Gacy. Jeffrey Dahmer, one of my favorite serial killer cases. The police spectacularly screwed up so many times on this guy, even when they had one of his victims who was bleeding over here because Dahmer was drilling into his into his brain and so forth. They gave him back to Jeffrey Dahmer because they believe Jeffrey Dahmer when he says he's drunk and we're just engaging in lovers' quarrel and stuff like that. Yeah. There's other cases, and then there's other cases of serial killers targeting not just queer people but even women whose names I'm blanking out on, but it's always the same. It's always the same story. People go to the police to blow the whistle on them, and the police keep spectacularly fucking up and just not giving a shit about it. The story of Changeling, the Wine Coop murders, is a spectacular story. The police spent more time going after the woman whose son was kidnapped. Robert Pickton, one of the great serial killers of Canada, who did not just target Indigenous women, who did not just target prostitutes, which was propaganda trying to go after the police who were blowing the whistle on police incompetency. Pickton was friends with the police who would party at his farm, and over, when people had evidence of Robert Pickton, the police went after the folks trying to expose this case.
Ed Buck, who would get young black men high on drugs so that he could have sex with them and didn't care if they OD'd and died. He was a Democratic Party political guy, big donor in Southern California. So the LAPD ignored him for years.
John Wayne Gacy, funny enough, was a Democratic.
Yes, he was related to people in the local Chicago machine, and so the Chicago cops were like, "Oh yeah, we know him. He's a good guy. He wouldn't be involved in stuff like this. He comes from a good family."
As was who was the other notorious serial killer?
Ted Bundy worked for Republicans.
Yes, he did.
Something Republican State Party chair, maybe.
Yes. And the Golden State Killer was Joseph D'Angelo, who was a cop for 6 years from 1973 to 1979 before he got fired for a shoplifting case, but didn't face criminal charges and never had any sort of record despite agreeing to do probation because he was a cop.
Oh, wait a minute. Wait 1 second. You guys said Ed Bundy. You guys
Ed Buck. I said Ed Buck and
Ted Bundy.
Ted Bundy.
You mean Ted Bundy?
Ted Bundy, yeah.
Two different people. Okay. Two different people. Ed Buck and Ted Bundy.
Okay. But yes, Ted Bundy was a great. So he was a big like Republican activist.
Well, I don't know about big, but he had an internship for like the RNC chair of his, not the RNC, the state party chair of his state or something like that.
I also think he was described once as a true believer. I like, listen, I know it's propaganda. I watch a lot of true crime stuff.
Yeah, I get you.
I think I recall that. Don't quote me on it, but
true crime is another great example of propaganda.
100%.
Because but it also shows how lazy and dumb the cops are, because it always reaches to we couldn't really figure anything out from the evidence, and all our leads were busts. So we just begged the public to help us and started investigating whatever the fuck lead they brought us, whether it was legitimate or not.
I'll tell you this, that what we were just talking about, what you guys were just talking about, is covered a lot of times in these stories. When the police screw something up, oftentimes these victims will then go to their legislators or legislators and lobby for laws to address this very, very specific thing that really didn't need to, a lot of times doesn't need to be explicitly addressed. It's just that things happen the way that they happen because of corruption and
it's like you also see often in these true crimes, you also see how some sort of victims' rights group passed some awful retaliatory law that throws the book about people accused of crimes potentially before they're convicted.
Exactly. Yeah, exactly right. And it's also this thing that you see. I see this all the time. Prosecutors, they complain. They say juries now want so much evidence. But when I was researching, when you told me what we were talking about, I did a little bit of Google searching, and I found a study.
CSI.
So the prosecutors complain about this, but the studies show that now any evidence presented as if it's done forensically is almost universally accepted, even if the science is bad or questionable. And so that's led to more convictions. But the prosecutors who lose are now saying it's the juries. They watch too much CSI.
CSI is humongous propaganda. But I just want to say to the person, L. Trotsky, 21st Century, the only reason I watch crime shows is to find evidence of police incompetency or complicity. That's exactly why I've been watching lots of stories about serial killers, because I'm actually more surprised at how much the police completely fuck up than, yes, it was because of our wonderful police work that we uncovered the crime. And actually, most of the times, it's the complete...
every one of these, and this is great because this is true. Every one of these typical true crime episodes about a specific murder follows a specific pattern. Number one, some sort of murder happens in the sort of small town where murders always happen, but where people in the local media always then say, this never happens here. That's the first universal truth about the crimes that get covered on true crime shows. Number one, they always happen in some small town or suburban or ex-urban setting where people in a certain class go around in a bubble where they say to themselves, that doesn't happen here, completely ignoring what the working class are doing a few blocks over and what's happening to them. So that's number one.
The number of times I've seen on an episode of, say, Dateline, where they say, not even just, this town isn't where it happens. They say, this neighborhood is not where that happens.
Yes.
That's the setup every single time. Right.
But in order for them to say every single time this never happens here, that means the significant numbers of these murders are not happening in the inner city where we're told to be scared of them, but happening in places where we're told it never happens. So that's number one. Yes. Number two, and this is the other universal truth. I mentioned it before, but I'm going to repeat it because it bears repeating. The cops charge the wrong person. That always happens first. They spend a lot of time wasting time investigating the wrong person because they're convinced he's guilty because of something stupid that happens in a police interview that would only be considered suspicious by a cop. Any normal person would consider that normal, but cops consider it suspicious. So that's number one. They always waste a massive amount of time investigating the wrong person because of something cops consider suspicious, but everybody else would consider totally normal. And then number three, This is the one that I specifically mentioned before. They reach the point where their false lead, because they suspected the wrong person, has run out. They have no idea what else to do. They start talking to everybody else again in the hopes that somebody else will present themselves as a possible suspect who said something only cops would consider suspicious. That either works out and they waste a bunch more time, or it doesn't work out and they reach the point where they say, we don't know what to do, help us, and start investigating every dumb lead that someone in the public offers them.
Oh my God, that's literally what happened when there was those two black snipers in Washington. This was sometime after 9/11. That's literally what happened with the police. At some
point, that's just one example.
And said, public, please help us. We are too dumb and incompetent to find out these.
But there are a lot of cold case shows out there about cases that were miraculously solved years later because of changes in DNA technology or somebody from outside investigating everything again. And the one thing that all the cold cases have in common is at some point cops just gave up, said, we don't know anything, please help our baby selves, and started investigating whatever dumb shit people brought them until they just stopped even bothering. And then it just sat there for years and years. Until for whatever reason, somebody gave them some reason to look at it again. Either a DNA hit came up after years, or all these other things that, had nothing to do with the cops actually being effective at solving crime themselves.
But then that's fascinating. That's fascinating in and of itself. And also, but that goes into a huge problem when it comes to propaganda, because now, it's great that DNA can vindicate people who have been wrongly put on death row or are just wrongly rotting in prison, but shows like CSI,
yes,
and Dexter, which is the most weirdest propaganda pro-death penalty.
No, so I'm going to say something about Dexter. Because this is really important. The TV show, for obvious reasons, the TV show could not go into the full depths explored by the books. I do recommend for people who saw Dexter and kind of liked the idea, but were maybe disappointed by the way the TV show worked out, I do recommend the book Darkly Dreaming Dexter by Jeff Lindsay. And I strongly recommend the sequels that rise from it. It's very important to understand that initially the book didn't make a huge splash, and it became well known because of the success of the TV show, and that the sequels to the book, which were made possible by the TV show, nevertheless go in a completely different direction from the TV show, because the TV show was all going in its own direction just from the end of the first book. So the only book, Darkly Dreaming Dexter, that's the only actual book that gets figured into the Dexter TV show. The author is Jeff Lindsay.
Oh, okay.
Chris, I got to tell you, I've read every Dexter book back in the day, and yes, I completely agree. It's a fascinating book series.
One of the things you have to understand, though, about the books versus the TV show is the TV show is kind of propaganda and kind of not. The book advances the idea that serial killers who only go after other serial killers and make every possible effort to make sure that they're really getting the right person might actually be better than cops because they wouldn't be corrupt.
My only problem with that is that it's that in a way it kind of basically says like,
well, what it's doing, what the book does is it tries to explore the idea of whether or not a compulsive killer can be a part of functional society. Now, what's interesting to me about the books is that unlike the TV show, in which he stops having contact with the kids because his wife is killed off, in the books, there is a very important relationship between him and the older daughter of his girlfriend and wife, because she is also a compulsive killer and she needs his help in order to not be a threat to society.
Okay.
So the book goes into this whole question of whether or not it's possible for certain kinds of people who have been labeled a certain way by law enforcement and the mental health establishment can actually integrate into society in some way. And it uses this sort of absurdist idea of serial killers going after bad people. But it's worth noting that the cops in Dexter are corrupt and incompetent and schmucks. There are no good guy cops in Dexter except for the one FBI profiler who gets killed, and Dexter's sister, and Dexter's best friend. But Dexter's best friend is so damn stupid. He doesn't realize that his best friend is the biggest serial killer around. And he's a cop.
But then that gets into an interesting thing. So Dexter works in the kind of
blood spatter.
Let's get off of Dexter and talk about CSI because a lot of people say now it's good. It is very good that DNA evidence can release people who have been wrongly imprisoned. But many people say to be very, very careful with the whole CSI type of stuff.
It's worth noting. It's worth noting that while DNA is extremely reliable for proving people didn't do something, the idea that it is actually any good for proving that people did do something has been deeply debunked on multiple levels. And we're actually seeing people who were convicted just on DNA evidence be released.
Talk a bit more about that, actually.
Well, so there are all sorts of, so even the strictest DNA match is not saying only that one person could have committed this crime. Even the strictest DNA match is saying something like, well, only 1 in 175,000 people could have committed this crime. Okay, fine. But you know how many people are there in the U.S. For total population? So you got to figure if you're actually running the stats, 1 in however many 100,000, well, in a country of millions of people, you might actually see 4 or 5 or 6 or 7 or 8 or 9 or 10 people who fall into that 1 in every 100,000 category.
Now, I do have a question here. So when I watch the Dateline, which is just my go-to for when I'm studying or whatever, I put it on in the background. That's why I consume it. But they always say something like, this is a 1 in 10 billion chance. So what is the
actual numbers are not 1 in 10 billion, but even 1 in 10 billion is not, it can only possibly be this one person. 1 in 10 billion is still a really, 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 really good guess.
Wow. Oh my God.
And I mean, I'm not saying, but the numbers aren't actually 1 in 10 billion. The numbers are like 1 in 100,000, 1 in 200,000, 1 in 300,000. There is no, it could only be this person DNA match that's actually possible. And it's a lot of the idea that, it could only be this person because of the numbers and the odds. This is as good as a finding of fact. We should be able to argue this as a finding of a fact in court that has been greatly undermined over the years. It's like, shaken baby syndrome has been outed as potential propaganda by child abuse experts looking for a way to prosecute more quote unquote bad parents. So so it's very possible that every person ever convicted of murder because of shaken baby syndrome was innocent.
Jesus Christ.
That's just, that's as possible as every one of them being guilty. because of the completely worthlessness, apparently, of the diagnosis, and the fact that it was only ever a thing with 2 or 3 experts whose expert opinion then became mainstreamed because of their support from law enforcement.
That's absolutely horrific. But then I wonder how. But then I wonder, in order to get to a cop-free world or a cop-free society, and for reasons which I don't want to get too into, let's simply look at the most advanced capitalist states. So that's the Five Eyes Alliance. That's America, Britain, Australia, New Zealand.
These days, I'm joking a little bit here. These days, that I would say that the most advanced capitalist state is China, because they have somehow managed to externalize the externalities of neoliberalism back on Western capital and sort of game neoliberalism for the benefit of their own working class in a limited and economic nationalist sort of way, while at the same time putting a very kind and gentle face on undermining American empire without actually advocating too strongly for any one alternative to American empire. They're finding the right way to actually compete in the alleged neoliberal system under the terms set by the neoliberals, and neoliberals don't like it. And there's a whole bunch of propaganda, if you like, both political, both actual law enforcement stuff, like myths about where fentanyl comes from. Fentanyl comes from the trailer park. The reason that chemical precursors for pharmaceutical drugs come from China has nothing to do with China trafficking fentanyl precursors. It has to do with the global supply chain, where every pharmaceutical company has outsourced certain manufacturing processes to China. If Bayer and Janssen, who make all the opiates, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot Purdue and the Sackler family. If Bayer and Janssen, because the way it works now, it's actually a beautiful system. Bayer grows the opium legally. They're still the biggest producer of legal opium in the world. Bayer, the aspirin company, who also patented heroin and a chemist working for Bayer invented heroin. And it was one of the best things to ever happen in history. And banning heroin was cruel to pain patients, but that's a whole nother show. But anyway, Bayer grows the opium in Afghanistan or in these big legal fields in Tasmania that are the biggest legal fields in the world. Bayer sells the opium to Purdue. And so between them, Bayer and Purdue have this big monopoly on all sorts of prescription opiates. Fentanyl was invented by a Belgian chemist. Shout out to Belgium, Youri.
Yeah.
Fentanyl was invented by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen. You may have heard of Janssen Pharmaceuticals.
I've not, but that's interesting.
Fentanyl was invented by a Belgian chemist named Paul Janssen, who started his own pharmaceutical empire off fentanyl in exactly the way that Bayer built an empire off aspirin and heroin. And Paul Janssen's contribution was to be able to make something that was even more potent than heroin, didn't get you high in quite the same way, and really, really worked effectively for pain. But you didn't need opium, which made it more affordable, and it cut around the Bayer to Purdue monopoly on these designer pain drugs.
But going back,
no, you know, the people who sell, just to get back to this, the people who sell opium-based designer drugs like oxycodone that don't work as well as heroin or fentanyl hate medical grade fentanyl because medical grade fentanyl breaks their monopoly and works better. And they hate street fentanyl because even if you get all the medical grade fentanyl out of the market or stop people from prescribing it, somebody can still find their local drug dealer and buy street fentanyl for less money than they get their oxy, and it works better. And when you really talk about the quote unquote opium epidemic, you have to understand that people who were not being properly treated for their pain by their oxy doctors were switching to fentanyl because it worked better and cost less. And then you were seeing the natural public health failure that results from that street fentanyl not being regulated and kept safe.
Yeah.
And this is the material analysis of drug use that even a lot of reactionary Marxists who tend to think of who still tend to think of drugs in the framework in which China and Russia thought about drugs as a weapon of the West against their internal stability.
Yeah.
And you know, we're not China and Russia. Drugs are not a weapon against the United States' internal stability in the hands of anyone but American capitalists. And if drugs were legalized, they would not be a threat to America's internal stability. The banning of heroin, which was done to empower cops, the banning of heroin, and again, the banning of heroin happened in the 1920s at the height of Prohibition, too. And it just was, heroin prohibition just wasn't reversed when alcohol prohibition was. So you have to think about that too.
Well, the other interesting thing was that was that during the what the Chinese call the century of humiliation, way before even the century of humiliation, many people would just go to these heroin dens or crack dens, consume heroin legally.
The opium den, the Chinese, the stereotypical Chinese opium den, which was ironically, like the wet market, a cultural tourist attraction for Westerners rather than a business that actually catered to the working class Chinese. However, Westerners in working for the British East India Company monopolized the opium crop and decided that they would be able to make more money if they turned opium into a consumer good in China, which led to the Opium Wars.
But if we go, but going back to what I wanted to talk about, and with respect to propaganda and how we overcome. Okay, so in advanced capitalist societies or declining ones, Britain, the United States, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and parts of Western Europe, notably France. What would you say to people who say that we still need the police as a necessary evil when it comes to apprehending serial killers?
Well, I would say you've done a really good job of covering the fact that cops aren't very good at apprehending serial killers. The story that always resonates with me is how one of Jeffrey Dahmer's victims was treated by the cops as a teenage runaway and returned to his legal guardian, who, as they thought, and they were giving the victim back to the serial killer. Just because a white guy said, "Hey, I'm this guy's legal guardian."
But also goes to show
you... And the teenager was Vietnamese.
No, but it also goes to show you something very disturbing about the police. Okay, let's say let's say let's say what Jeffrey Dahmer said was true, that we were just having lovers quarrel. That basically means, so if somebody's beating the shit out of their spouse, whether they're in a same-sex relationship or not, the police are just not going to do anything about it.
Well, this
Which
is
I think, which is actually often the problem when we talk about.
also think about this.
So that's often, which is often the problem when we talk about stalkers and people who actually are victims of domestic violence. The police don't do anything until they're basically knocking on heaven's door, or they're 6 feet under, and then
Well,
they
the
do something, and then they don't really do jack shit.
Cops are themselves abusers on a very large scale. The number that gets thrown around a lot is, you see, well, 40% of cops are domestic abusers. And it's like, no. That's a scary number, but it's actually worse than that. 40% of cops are admitted domestic abusers who self-reported themselves and are still on the job with no consequences.
But then how do we how do we address the issue of serial killers? And look, and I'm ready to even admit that people who do engage in serial killing is probably very low. But if we talk about defunding the police and being very strict and say to the police,
in the sense, not actually. Now, I'm not going to talk about the mechanics of actually, because obviously the mechanics of actually arresting someone are carried out by the police. That's how our society works. If someone is actually arrested, the police do it. That said, how many serial killers are actually caught by police, in the sense that it is the work of the cops that identifies and arrests and says this is definitely the guy? How often do the cops actually catch a serial killer, in that sense of they find the evidence, they say, yeah, this is the guy? I would say almost never. In fact, the cops have often ignored somebody whose picture has been going around for weeks, and you find out months later, oh yeah, the cops talked to that guy 10 times and never even thought he did it. And then some reporter publishes something, and then the cops arrest the guy. And I'm not even pretending reporters aren't guilty of propaganda, because they are. But very often it's reporters who do work cops get credit for.
So are you saying then that if we actually did properly defund the police and only gave the police strict set of instructions, the money we're giving to you is only for apprehending serial killers?
If we had, that's the whole thing. If we had a Department of Serial Killer Investigation, that would potentially look very different than a police department.
Do explain.
Well, I mean, so you'd have something that was geared towards actually trying to discover and tell the story of the crime in a material way. Not something that was involved around a certain outcome in the courts and the media in order to project the image that the cops that are out there keeping you safe and that criminals are being punished. But an actual, how do we study and understand and tell the material stories of crime so that we can decide what to do about them? I mean, if you look to go back to the Ed McBain propaganda theory, the seductive Ed McBain propaganda theory is that our cops, as they exist now, could and should be people who tell the stories of crimes in order to determine how crimes should be approached, as opposed to people who bust people who threaten property for capitalists. Their first story is about a mugger, and the cops are trying to catch a mugger. And at some point, yes, the mugger does kill somebody, but it's not even about a murder investigation until like halfway through the story. It's an investigation of a mugger in a working class neighborhood. And the idea is the cops are trying to find out who the mugger threatening the working class neighborhood is. Now, that's not what actually happens. That's the sort of thing that could exist under some sort of workers' democracy, but we can't have under capitalism. Under capitalism, all we can say is abolish the police.
Well, that goes to what I was wanting to say here. You talk about, like, I see two different conversations happening around all of this. It's like the systemic issues with policing as an institution that is only about protect. I mean, honestly, everybody knows this. There are those who are policed and there are those who get the protection from the policing, right? So that's what we're up against. And I think propaganda and everything that we're talking about boils down to, it's like, okay, let me take a break here. It's like the Constitution of the United States. We are all sold this idea: life, liberty, the pursuit of happiness. All men are created equal. The actual system that was built off of that thing is not that, though. We have this mythology. We have this idea of what we want it to be. I think it's the same thing here. We have this idea of what we want policing to be. It's getting the bad guys off the street. But what we're actually doing is so far beyond that thing that the system is broken, and we're not addressing it. So, like, anytime you tell a story, you want to tell a good story about a cop who solves the crime, but it becomes propaganda because the system isn't that.
And this is where we get to the central question. Well, what do we believe policing is, and what is policing? So we believe policing is the solving of crimes because of the way propaganda presents policing in our society. Well, what is policing actually in a historical, material sense? What is the context for policing? In the specific context of the United States, policing is the control of the black population, and it evolved out of slave patrols. It includes a lot of other groups who have been shoehorned in along with black people, but ultimately it comes down to controlling the black portion of the population. In Canada, the historical material conditions of policing, as you can see through the history of the Royal Canadian Mounted Police, policing is about controlling Indigenous people and about controlling people who sort of live outside of the bounds of capitalist society, who are trying to do their own thing and build their own system outside of official acceptable Canada.
And same thing, and you can say the same thing about what you just described, the U.S. and Canada with Australia and New Zealand.
In Australia and New Zealand, in Australia, you have exactly the same sort of racial eliminationist rationale for policing that you do in Canada. In the U.S., the eliminationist aspect is sort of one step removed, because traditionally in the U.S., genocide was done by the military.
Well, there were lots of militia raids on native lands. I mean, like the entire. Exactly. I would argue that you've got two joint things happening here. In the West, you've got militia raids on native lands under the guise of, we have to do law enforcement, we have to protect. Then you had slave patrols in the South that were just explicitly, but the whole thing came back to, we have to police these people who are not part of the white Christian society. It's, I mean, you know,
and then even before Canada and the US, policing in London evolved as a need to control the unemployed working class adults who had been removed from the workforce by an industrial revolution that replaced them with machines and children.
And the main goal of the Metropolitan Police, Scotland Yard, was basically to eradicate Irish nationalism.
Oh no! It's so much better than that, because it's the absolute perfect case study for like your traditional Trotskyist, your Trotskyist examination of policing as it serves the bourgeois. Because the London Metropolitan Police were literally founded to stop bourgeois whining about theft. And the reason that the bourgeois were whining about theft is because the Industrial Revolution had put so many men out of work, there were only two ways that working class adults could make a living in London during the Industrial Revolution. Option one, have kids and put them to work for you. That's not very morally satisfying to anyone. Even the parents may not be happy with it. That was the legal option, though. And the other option was participation in crime, which meant there were a whole lot of thieves in London stealing stuff from the bourgeois and petty bourgeois. And the bourgeois and petty bourgeois wanted their shit back.
And when
the
many
way
of those,
that the petty bourgeois,
when many of those prisons were,
even before we haven't gotten to the prisons yet,
they would send those poor Irish and British and Scots and Welsh.
Even before we get there, though, and it's worth noting that Georgia in the United States was also originally a penal colony. They transported felons to Georgia. And the felons transported to Georgia became the plantation owner class of Georgia. And so when you want to say that the capitalists are literally the criminals, in Georgia, it's true.
But
well, guys, there's something else I was just thinking about, talking about the origins of policing. Go back to the origins of the legal system. Like the first thing you learn about, like what are the first legal codes ever written or whatever, the code of Hammurabi, what to do whenever, punishing slaves and laws about slavery. That's like the basis of our entire legal system, is like, that tells you something. Like the entire purpose has always been about controlling capital and protecting the assets of the wealthy elite.
It's worth noting, though, that the Code of Hammurabi, for all the ways that we sort of look at it and go, wow, that's harsh shit. The Code of Hammurabi says right in the very open part of it, very beginning, before it gets into the meat and drink, the only purpose of the law is to make people's lives better. And if government doesn't make people's lives better, there's no point to it.
And if we talk, and also
the Code of Hammurabi says this, though. I mean, the point of the Code of Hammurabi establishing all the punishments for all the crimes was so that there was a list of the punishments and people couldn't arbitrarily do worse to people, which is something that we don't think about a lot now, because we tend to think of, punishment as this regime of punishment for its own sake. They were officially posting the legal punishments because people were doing worse to people on their own.
By the way, this is also very important when we talk about propaganda and how the police actually function in real life.
Yes.
Alphonse Bertillon, I think that's how you say his name. He was a French officer, and he was the guy who came up with the whole concept of the mugshot, which, by the way, some states and places in the world refuse to use mugshots because they think it
prejudices people. The mugshot makes someone look like a criminal already. It's deliberately designed to make people look like a criminal. The French guy who invented the mugshot to in order to publish them in the newspapers to influence juries.
And not only that, Alphonse Bertillon was implicated in the infamous, the epic, horrendous scandal known as, drumroll please, Dreyfus Affair.
You're saying the cops are the real anti-Semites? Who would have thought?
I do want to go back though and point out that I'm very deliberate in my bringing up of Hammurabi, because
Sure.
the laws were still tiered. They weren't the same for enslaved people and other people. It was still about protecting property. It was still all of those things.
Oh
I
yeah.
mean, it wasn't an altruistic, we're
No,
doing
it
this to
wasn't.
protect enslaved people. And I want to make sure that that's clear.
But the Code of
deliberately chose
Hammurabi
that
starts with a statement that the only purpose of the law is to make people's lives better,
I mean,
that our government has
but the-
distinctly abandoned. And I
But
wanted
you
to
say
bring
that,
that
you
up
say that,
too.
but they still say that. They still believe they're doing it for those
Sure.
reasons. So you can state that in your document that then goes on to describe a two-tiered system for slaves versus non-enslaved people. The core
True.
element is the same. It arises from that need to protect the status quo of whatever system it is that it's protecting. And that's why
Sure.
it still exists today. So I just want to push back and say I was very deliberate in that choice, because I do believe that it's I think that it's very indicative.
No, and that's
I also want to add something to what Seth said, and I'm very glad you mentioned the military and Native Americans and indigenous people. The police, were the reality of the police and the fact that they are mostly irredeemable assholes, and most of them are rotten apples, not fit for even consumption. I think folks need to listen to the Ice Cube song "Good Cop, Bad Cop," and as an antidote to the military and the police being a force for good, folks should watch Brian De Palma's 2 films, Casualties of War and Redacted. Why do I say this? Because the military and how the military protects its sociopath can be summed up like this. The military are the police on steroids, and the fact that anytime someone uses the term police state or a military state means that the military and the police they're designed to be the assholes and state terrorists they are, especially in a settler capitalist state of any form.
So I'm going to go ahead and go back to our chat here. Ruling classes always set up pillars to maintain and bolster the form of social relations. The issue is not whether these institutions are necessary, in my opinion, but which social class controls them. And this is where the discussion of abolition matters the most, because when we talk about socialism, we're not talking about reforming capitalism. We're talking about abolishing capitalism and replacing it with a system democratically controlled by workers and peasants. And I use that phrasing very specifically because that's the stage in our development we need to get to, in my opinion. We need a system democratically controlled by workers and peasants and not bosses and landlords. I define the worker as anybody who is either doing the work or who would be doing the work if they were not forced into a role of not doing the work by precarity or disability. My definition of peasants is anybody who pays rent in order to do work. Now, this is something we don't think about a lot, but who pays rent in order to do work? Tenant farmers in the South pay rent to do work. There are people who end up stuck in multi-level marketing campaigns who have to buy everything from their own supplier, who in effect pay rent to do work. There are people in the gig industry who have to supply their own means of production in order to be supplied with contract work by a middleman. They are paying rent in a very real way to do work. And of course, and all of this matters. We have people in our society who pay rent to do work. Undocumented laborers are often forced to pay rent to do work. People in corrupt union-controlled industries, not the union bosses themselves, but the rank-and-file workers who cannot work without paying their union dues, pay rent to do work. we have classes of people who pay rent to do work, and in a structure like some unions, and I have to agree with the Socialist Equality Party and their willingness to be critical here. If you have a situation where the people who control the union share their interests with the bourgeois class, then what you have is a situation where aristocrats in the union collect rent from peasants in the union so that the peasants can do work the aristocrats supply them with but do not do. And it's worth thinking about all this. Because, yes, a union can be a force for liberation, but in a capitalist system, when suborned by capital, a union is an institution that can become an institutional landlord. In New York, the union that is supposed to represent home care workers is actually the home care workers' boss under a very repressive system in which the management of regulating for home care workers is outsourced from the state to the union in a way that puts the union in the role of repressing the home care workers for private capital and the state. And it's worth commenting on all this when we're criticizing our system, because you can't just adopt a 1930s syndicalist approach that we can just have a general strike through the union system. It's a little more complicated than that. There are good arguments for either your anarchist mass movement outside of the existing institutions or your Marxist-Leninist vanguard party. But both are more important alternatives right now than organized liberal politics. And participation in organized liberal politics needs to understand that we have to advance a class agenda as opposed to just making a bunch of compromises over the rules by which the class system is maintained.
And when we talk about propaganda, so there's the problem of manipulative junk science of CSI,
Yes.
and what Bertolion, who did the mug shots, who was implicated in the Dreyfus scandal. But another propaganda, I'm actually quite shocked that even comes from a fairly left-wing group, Dropkick Murphys, their song "We Got the Power," which was in the Rock Against Bush Volume 2, the song, which talks about unions and so forth, is advocating for police unions. And the song talks about the Boston police strike. If you're familiar with this, Seth or Chris, please talk about it, and again push back against the idea that police are working class and are worthy of solidarity with them.
Which is there a year for that? Is there a year for that Boston police strike?
Yeah, I got it right here in 1919.
So I would say, for one thing, there's a big difference between pre-prohibition era working class cops in 1919 and the LAPD police union now.
Or the NYPD, for that matter.
Or for that NYPD, for that matter.
And all the other disgusting carbon copies. Like the
in 1919, the police were striking and rioting with the rest of the labor movement. The first Red Scare in the 1920s, 1930s, that really diffused a lot of the pro-working class sentiment among the cops, and cops who were investigating communists as a threat to the system were investigating unions as places where there might be communists. And this is where you see the deep and harmful split during the World War II era and the post-World War II era between the radical Teamsters Union that is firebombing warehouses and the reactionary police union that is demonizing the Teamsters as communist terrorists in the 1930s.
Funnily enough, though, the Teamsters unions, which unfortunately were infiltrated by organized crime.
The Teamsters are now a cop union. That's the great irony, is now the Teamsters are a cop union and there are Teamster cops.
But did the police knowingly allow this to happen and not stop that from happening because A, they could use that as a way to demonize the Teamsters, but B, the police look away at a lot of, organized crime.
I'm going to go way back in history here now. And I'm going to tell you how, I'm going to tell you sort of how something like this happens. During the Roman Civil War, the first Roman Civil War, even before Julius Caesar, a man named Lucius Cornelius Sulla was fighting against another man named Gnaeus Papirius Carbo for control of the Roman Republic. Carbo had ousted Sulla, who was an aristocrat and anti-democratic and very much about the old aristocratic constitution, and had put in place a political machine that paid lip service to democracy but really represented the interests of the commercial business class. Carbo's army was under the command of a man named Scipio Asiagenes, who didn't want to fight Sulla and made a sort of truce with him to sort of hold off the fight for as long as possible. And while the truce was happening, Scipio's men and Sulla's men started hanging out in the same swimming pool and making friends. And then when Scipio was actually ready to fight, all of his men defected to Sulla, and he had to run for it by himself because he didn't have an army anymore. And I think that story is always illustrative when we're asking, well, did they allow this to happen, or was there we should actually promote this? I mean, almost any time you have to ask the question, somebody's promoting it. Even if it's not the person in charge, somebody's agitating for, we should make these friendly relationships to suborn the other side because it's just going to work out to our benefit in the long run. I mean, and that's how RFK Jr. got enough phony left-wing support wrapped up to be able to deliver, at least in Donald Trump's mind, enough votes to make it worth making him Health and Human Services Secretary.
Unbelievable. But yeah,
the cops deliberately encouraged their people to join unions like the Teamsters and the Service Employees International Union, because that would just suborn actual union movements and water them down and associate them with cops. And, now if you're an SIU chapter planning a strike, cops might know what you're up to if there are cops in your SEIU local. Just something to think about.
Interesting. And that whole idea that the cops are a working class and they're worthy of our solidarity. I think no propaganda show shows that more brilliantly, and it's so stupidly when you even do minimal research on the police than Blue Bloods.
Which is hilarious, because what's the name of the show, Blue Bloods? It's about a cop family. They're aristocrats. They're multiple generations of cops. What's working class about that? This is generational power.
But they would argue, well, we're labor aristocracy, but more labor, less aristocracy, right? Or
Tom Selleck is the police chief, is he not? That's ruling class. I mean, that's really the thing. Is ultimately the thing you have to remember is Tom Selleck is the police chief. He's a member of the ruling class. His interests are not the interests of any worker, no matter how much he tries to present himself as a guy who's been a working cop all his life. He's the police chief, and his kids are the police chief's kids who are cops and advancing their careers as cops because they're the police chief's kids. This is aristocracy. It's in the name, blue bloods.
So is it safe to say that the military, they protect the global 1%ers, the global plutocrats, and the police are just there to keep the working class in line, especially Native Americans, Black people, Latinx folks, immigrants, legal or otherwise, immigrants of all colors and creeds.
So there's a book. There's a book, a very famous book, gets thrown around a lot in left-wing circles, despite the fact that its author was a member of the military-industrial complex all his life, called War is a Racket, by a U.S. Army general named Smedley Butler. Now, before he published the book War is a Racket, Smedley Butler first became famous as someone who was invited by the leaders of Wall Street business concerns to lead a fascist coup against FDR, and who said, "No, you fuckers, I'm not a Nazi, I'm reporting you." Now,
exactly, yeah.
That is how he became famous. He then used his fame to publish War is a Racket, which is a story of his time running the military occupation of the Philippines for the U.S. Army, in which he describes how the whole purpose of the U.S. Army's being there was to serve the interests of American corporations, and the same American corporations whose interests were served by the U.S. Army occupying the Philippines were also ripping the Army off in every possible way to profit off its existence. And he weaves these narratives together of imperialism, both as a way to rob people overseas and the military-industrial complex around the Army as a way to rob the federal government and make people rich off imperialism. And that's like the perfect, I mean, that's the perfect contradiction on both levels of imperial capitalism. You have two levels. You have the level where the state steals things from other countries for the active gain of its own country's capitalists. And then you have the racket whereby which those same capitalists rip off the working class of their own country through those state institutions.
But there's perks, but the U.S. has definitely, in order to make sure that the mostly working class of all colors join the military, is you join the military and kill a bunch of brown and black people.
So let's talk about this.
And then you get the free, you get the universal health care, you get the universal mental health care, and you get to go to college for free and whatnot.
But is this a working class?
The police. Right?
But so then, is this a working class though, or is this an elite professional military class? Is this a working class, or is this a special class of the petite bourgeois that gets their access to capital through their generational participation in the military?
Interesting.
Now, we already know that cops are a special section of the petite bourgeois and bourgeois who get their generational privilege and generational wealth from participating in policing. So it is only natural to then say, in a completely volunteer military, where everyone in the military is either a citizen buying in for the benefits they get, and therefore a mercenary, or a professional soldier participating for a paycheck and therefore a mercenary. We have a special class of petty bourgeois mercenaries gaining access to capital by being willing to do violence for the state to advance their class status in America.
Fascinating. So does that? So ergo, there is no reforming the police. There is no reforming.
When you see,
you can only abolish it.
The police are the domestic version of what we do with the military. We give people special class privileges in order for them to help the ruling class discipline the working class and all the quote unquote criminal classes that are locked out of success in the capitalist system. And all propaganda boils down to convincing us that the cops are our friends when they are really our oppressor.
Well, you know, this reminds me of something I've been thinking about for a long time, is the way in which our society globally certain cultures have dominated, and those cultures have been the ones that prioritize having a powerful state. And that state is almost a revolving door. The people who are within this apparatus don't matter. They get access to those those perks, let's call them.
Not just
that's that can be changing, but that powerful central state and those state interests are what have driven colonialism, imperialism, everything throughout. At least
what's so interesting,
recorded history, and they've dominated and snuffed out every single society that prioritized humanity or cooperation. I mean, look at indigenous societies across the United States and the Americas.
Well,
a lot of those were not state, central statist societies. I don't know how to say it. That wasn't their priority. So they got destroyed by those dominant states that didn't prioritize anybody's humanity. Everybody was expendable. The only thing that matters is that large apparatus. And that's what's dominated this world. And so when we're up against these systems, that's really what we're up against. You can't separate policing from capitalism from the actual state itself at this moment, because they all fuel each other in my mind, right? So to talk about abolishing policing before we get past capitalism or the system that we have set up now is not going to. I don't see a way.
When you talk about abolishing policing, that's the same thing as when you talk about demanding the overthrow of capitalism. You're making a point about your ultimate goals when it comes to the class system, as opposed to arguing for nibbling reform around the edges. People need to understand, hey, we're not anti-cop because we're pro-crime. We're anti-cop because we're pro-freedom of the city, and the cops are the people whose power is used to oppress the working class and marginalized classes of the city.
Exactly.
Fascinating. Yeah. And I think one last horrific police scandal of how the police are utterly incompetent when it comes to apprehending serial killers, and the fact that the police and the state themselves are probably complicit in the serial killer and his human trafficking, was the Marc Dutroux scandal of Belgium. I'll let other people do their research and watch enlightening documentaries about that, because it will disturb you to the core. So, yeah. Every now and then I read up again on the Monster of Florence case that inspired the character of Hannibal Lecter. Do tell. I don't know this. I do not know this story.
Oh, the Monster of Florence. You don't know them? Oh, that's its own TV show for its own thing. But there is a specific sort of cannibal killer whose crimes in Florence in 50s, 60s, 70s, I'm not quite sure, probably 1950s. His specific crimes in Florence and the emphasis on cannibalism inspired both the specific events that were described in the novel Hannibal and the more general character of Hannibal Lecter as originally depicted in the book Red Dragon.
Interesting.
Hannibal Lecter is, of course, most famous for being in The Silence of the Lambs with Anthony Hopkins and Jodie Foster, and then eating Ray Liotta's brain in the Hannibal movie.
He's in a lot of transphobic tripe.
Well, again, it's worth noting that in both the movie and the book, it is fundamentally important that Hannibal Lecter tells Clarice Starling, no, he's not trans.
Exactly.
He is acting out a fantasy.
And in fact, they also made that clear about Psycho, that Norman Bates is not a homosexual, cross-dresser, or even trans. He has severe trauma and multiple personalities.
The book that everyone should read is Robert Bloch's Psycho 2, which has nothing to do with the movie and should be read as its own. It's worth noting that the sequel to Psycho is not, in Robert Bloch's writing, is not about Norman Bates, but is about the psychiatrist who becomes obsessed with Norman Bates.
Fascinating.
And it's so you've got that early sort of messed up thinking already in Robert Bloch's sequel to Psycho, and Psycho it goes really far back to your fundamental shaping of the psychological thriller version of crime fiction, which is spawned a lot of serial killer fiction, even though Norman Bates is actually not a serial killer since he only kills 2 people and doesn't make it to number 3 in the course of the book.
But a little bit off topic, actually. Can I ask Seth a question?
Of course.
Yeah.
So Seth, so you work a lot with Native Americans, or are you of an indigenous background?
I am biracial Navajo. My grandmother was forcefully assimilated in the 1940s. She was removed. I mean, that's the nice way to say it. She was removed from her home, placed into a boarding school. Met my grandfather at 17. He was in the military. He was also 17. He was on his brother's name. It was a crazy story.
So in Canadian terms, Seth's grandmother survived a residential school.
Yes, she did. And so, we got relocated here in West Virginia. That's where we are now. So I'm a member of the Navajo Nation. My mother, my grandmother, my whole family is. And so we did the Native American West Virginia Indigenous Caucus with the Democratic Party here. And that was the craziest thing that ever happened, because they just fundamentally denied our right to we were in trouble for everything from being too restrictive of making it you had to have tribal affiliation to be a voting member. That was too restrictive, to then also labeling us too white to be actually Native American. Every single thing that you could learn from the history of the United States and the way they treated Native Americans, it happened in a microcosm here in West Virginia.
Wait. So they did blood quantum on you, basically?
No. We did what we decided. We had a lot of people coming in trying to become voting members to take over the caucus from us, because there were a lot of internal issues. So we made a rule that you had to be affiliated with a tribe to be a voting member. They didn't like that at all, because they said that was restrictive. But then at the same time said, we're not really Native American. So like I said, everything was contradictory. Yeah. It's the same. And that's a tactic, right? That's why they wanted to they wanted to remove us off the reservation so that they could tell us, you're not part of that culture anymore. Don't act like that. Don't be like that. That's not your culture. You're now in America. Be American. The whole point of this is to erase indigenous culture from America. It's not so much about the DNA as it is making sure everybody fits the same.
Well, and this should be noted, the point of genocide, to erase people and replace them. This is what is happening in Palestine as we speak, when they say, well, there's no such thing as Palestinians.
Well, real quick, let me point this out too, because this is something I've just learned recently. Demographically speaking, by the year 2080, there will be almost zero, practically zero people born with enough quantum, let's say, the quarter ancestry that's required to be Navajo. There will not be enough people born to maintain citizenship. So nobody after 2080 statistically should be born, not should be, but will likely be born with enough Navajo blood to be eligible for membership. The genocide's not over. It's in its final stages. And there's so what the Democratic Party did to us here in West Virginia is truly devastating, because my goal has been and always will be to connect the diaspora that was lost and separated through these federal policies aimed at separating us, to kind of reunite everybody again and get tribes. We need to have, and I'm probably the only person saying this right now, the tribes definitely aren't, and I'll be a little be out there. I think we need to get past this point of separate of sovereignty in the way that we have it today, because it's really not equal whatsoever. We need to repatriate these tribes, get statehood for we need to figure out how to make them functional states with representation in Congress. And that's been my goal. I would love to see that happen in some capacity. So I want to work with tribes. I want to work with diaspora natives. I want to make this happen in some capacity. And I'm just saying the Democratic Party is not helpful in any way. They have been an obstacle to that. So
now, this is a libertarian solution from a dystopian future in a cyberpunk role-playing game, and it should not be considered ideal. But in the in-game history of the sort of weird cyberpunk fantasy game Shadowrun, the Navajo and the Hopi get around this whole blood quantum thing by changing their tribes into what they call the Pueblo Corporate Council, giving everybody who's a member of the tribe a share of stock, and then making holding stock in the corporation the official definition of being an indigenous American of Navajo or Hopi descent.
To be clear, a lot of this is tied into federal funding. The federal funds are only going the higher the quantum is for your tribe.
Yes,
recognize you get more money. So there are tribes who have lowered that level and they've taken the hit. And
there are tribes in Massachusetts that have been rendered judicially extinct by law because not enough of their members meet federal blood quantum requirements. So you can't have a casino. You're white. Sorry.
Right. And so that's actually the purpose of the blood quantum.
Yes.
It was always about making sure that we dwindled over time. Like everyone who says this isn't a genocide is really ignoring the
because the oldest states in the country, Virginia and Massachusetts, almost all the original indigenous tribes have been deregistered because of not enough people who meet blood quantum requirements that the federal government sets for those tribes.
Exactly. That's a major problem, is this connection between it's like we are on a I don't know my brain I wasn't prepared to talk about this, but it's like a short leash. You get what you get if you follow our rules exactly. And by the way, these rules are going to make sure you're gone in 100 years.
Yes.
And it's a situation like we just had RFK Jr. out at the Navajo Nation. I follow the social media of the president of the nation. And first of all, his statement was written by ChatGPT. So clearly I was devastated by that point. But then to go on, and he's ass kissing RFK Jr. And it's the same thing I see. He's always like out there praising the Latter-day Saints. These are the people who ran the schools and who wanted to remove Native Americans from their home. But it's because we're over we don't have many options. And I understand the Latter-day Saints, but it hurts us in the long run.
I mean, I hate to buy into it. The Latter-day Saints are the group that committed a atrocity against other white people and then blamed indigenous people for it.
Yeah, but they gave us
So-
money one time, so now we're all good.
Well, I mean, they gave you money to help them do the thing that they blamed you
Well,
for.
and also, it doesn't even make up for what they've done to us in the past. Like what
yeah.
they're doing now is definitely, this is owed to us by these people for what they've
Yes.
done, and for us to have to, basically be overly gracious, let's say, and that's the expectation. It's kind of like J.D. Vance talking to Zelensky. What have you said? Thank you. That's the same exact vibe that we get.
You
when
notice
we're dealing with these people.
You notice, and this ties into propaganda because NCIS just had to put a Mossad agent on the cop team and then make her a likable character on top of everything else. This likable, quirky weirdo.
NCIS is one of those shows that has to be one of the worst offenders in terms of, I believe they have actual Pentagon and Navy representatives.
NCIS is that show that they made like JAG before it that manages to capture propaganda and imperialist propaganda and put them right there on the same plate in front of you every week.
Cough, cough, 24. So, Seth, so Seth, two quick things. So, number one, open invitation. I have to have you come on 1+1 because I believe very strongly in Indigenous solidarity and having Indigenous voices. Don't get enough Native Americans on, so it would be an honor to have you come on.
Anytime. I need to get back onto Twitter.
You guys are both on Substack, by the way.
Oh, you're on Substack would be better. I don't get on Twitter. I've missed out on a lot of
easiest way to get in touch with Seth right now is on Substack. Yeah, and that goes for everyone else who used to follow him on Twitter too.
Yeah, I don't do Twitter. Elon has just I don't want to give numbers to that site anymore. So I just don't.
I can totally understand that. My problem is they're all problematic. The Substack guy has his own annoying Nazi ties.
I actually saw that just like a week ago and was devastated.
Yeah, it's like the Blue Sky is just what's his name, Jack, who was Twitter before. Yeah. So it's all the same.
You're right. Well, like I just said, I've been thinking about getting back onto Twitter for that reason. It doesn't seem like everybody's really left, and I'm missing out on a lot of conversations that I
mean, I'm torn in both directions. I would love to get off Twitter because I feel like I'm suppressed there, and people who used to see my stuff haven't seen my stuff because of the way that Twitter has changed, because of the way Elon has messed with everything, and just because of Elon's extreme competition approach towards Substack and YouTube. He's been deprioritizing YouTube and Substack links in favor of people with paid Twitter links.
Right, my impressions went way down. That's also one of the reasons I left. Is like I don't get a lot of interaction.
He wants you to run your show by paying for an account and by streaming on Twitter instead of Substack or YouTube, and by writing on Twitter instead of Substack. And he just wants to monopolize that whole independent media creator thing in order to both control the message and to drive advertising a certain way.
But so Seth, I have to ask this question, which is, what do you think it's going to take for the left in the U.S. and the various people power movements? So that's like the white working class, that's the anti-imperialist movement, the Palestine justice movement, the Black liberation movement, the Latinx movement, the immigrant rights movement, the broad people power movements in the U.S. What do you think it's going to take for them to show more urgent solidarity to the plight of Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans?
That's a great question. And, honestly, if I knew the answer to that, my caucus probably wouldn't be defunct. I'm going to be honest with you. I tried everything that I could. I've engaged journalists. The closest I ever got to a story being written about what was going on relating to Indigenous issues in the Democratic Party, I had a journalist interview me and several other people from this affirmative action committee who were alleging racial discrimination. She interviewed me twice and a couple of other people at least once. Went back and forth with her for over a month for her to finally write and say her editor killed the story because the owner of the paper was the at the time Democratic minority leader, Doug Scaff. He switched over to Republican. He killed the story. He said, we're not running that story. And she just wrote us and said, we're not going to do anything with it. And that's not the closest. I guess the closest I got to being was when Jordan Cheriton of Status Coup News.
Absolutely.
He
politics.
He is
great coverage on Native America, on the plight of Native
Oh,
Americans.
he's awful. He's one of the worst people I've ever encountered in my life. I'll say that. I'll take any hit that I get for that. He past tensed my alive grandmother and said that I wasn't Native American to defend the Democrats here in West Virginia who were going to him with this fluff story about the progressive takeover of West Virginia Democratic politics. And he has refused to engage beyond that, except for those public statements. And he put out a video. When he shared that, he shared a video that the Democrats here had gotten from my friend Marianne Clater, who was the first African American to win a statewide primary in West Virginia. We did like a podcast together, and we were talking about passing. And clearly, when I'm talking to Marianne about passing, I am taking the, I am the passer of the two of us. So that was the conversation. We were trying to make it lighthearted about what happens whenever you're passing and how there's two different levels of racism. There's the systemic racism, like what happened to my grandmother and what continues to happen with cultural erasure and all of that, versus the direct impact racism that other people experience from how they look. Two very different conversations. And in that space with Marianne and I, it was thought to be safe. These white Democrats got a hold of it and they said, Seth doesn't think he's Indian. He doesn't think he's Native American. Listen to how he's joking about how he's not Indian. And so they used that in multiple hearings against me. And so when Jordan shared that thing about my grandmother, he said, Seth's not even Native American. His grandmother was Navajo. And like, she's still alive. I'm going to her house today for dinner. She's making Navajo tacos, the fry bread. Like, I don't understand where these people get off talking about my personal life, my family, when it's about politics. So I've seen how insidious and how nasty even the supposed allies can be whenever we're talking about access journalism or access to powerful people. We've got to get past the point where only certain people matter, right? And so, like, what happened to me in West Virginia has been, I've had to go to get psychiatric care because of what they've done to me here. It has been one of the most miserable experiences of my life. The last 4 years have been rotten, right? And we lost. We ultimately were destroyed, told that we had no standing. The National Democrats came out and said that we had no standing. It's done. It's a dead issue. And we did everything that we could to stand up for what the Democrats claim to espouse, what their ideals are supposed to be. We followed all of their rules. We did the grievance process. We went to the letter. I consulted attorneys that helped me with these grievances, only to be told you didn't do it right, or this isn't the right procedure. And then they'll change the rules after the fact and just move on because there's no enforcement mechanism. And so what people have to understand is, like, I'm turning people off from electoral politics all the time because we need a movement in this country that forces, like, you can try to elect new leaders. They're going to fall to the same systems. We need to force whatever means necessary the people who are in power right now to act right now in our best interest. Otherwise, this thing is wheels coming off. We're in the, I see the Navajo Nation is actually headed towards extinction. I kind of feel the same way about America as a whole. I mean, they rise up together, right? Like, Native Americans were here for the entire rise of this United States, for the entire rise, the history of this country. We were here side by side with every one of those founders. And I we're not making it past 2080, but I don't know that this country is either. And I, for one, Reverend Wright had it right. There's chickens. They're coming home to roost. And
well, what I find the most frustrating, and this is a criticism I'm about to make towards even the best of the left, particularly in America, when it comes to Palestine solidarity, when it comes to the kind of broad Black left movement, even Latinx movement, and even the best of the anti-imperialist movement. So, take, for example, when we talk about police brutality, Native Americans are the ones that are most murdered by the police, and yet that's never acknowledged. People talk a lot about settler colonialism and how that needs to be eradicated in Palestine, and yet I asked Norman Finkelstein when he was on Eve Engler's program, what do you think it's you talk a lot about settler colonialism, what do you think it's going to take for more urgent solidarity towards Native Americans? And he actually said that that's not one of his biggest issues that keeps him up at night.
So,
And
well,
yet
you got to
he has
really
and yet
think
he
about
has
this.
the nerve to use
Right.
terms like settler colonialism and decolonization for Israel. And I've seen black leftist journalists who actually have been to Native American reservations, so they know their plight inside out. And yet when I ask them about solidarity towards Native Americans, they say the following: well, some Native Americans had slaves, ergo, I'm not going to show them solidarity until they show us black people solidarity, even though the plight of black people gets talked endlessly and whatnot.
I will break in here to just say that when it comes specifically to certain white Jewish anti-Zionists, there is a good episode on Black Liberation Media of I Mix What I Like with Dr. Gerald Ball, where he talks with Norman about some of these issues rather directly, and it doesn't really reflect well on Norman. And I would refer people to I Mix What I Like and Black Liberation Media if they have more interest in that topic, and leave it at that.
Real quick, guys, I would like to point out you asked a question, and I have a very real, very honest answer. If you are not very visibly Native American in the stereotypical sense, and if you don't live on a reservation, you do not. We are policed in our identity. We don't get to claim that from other white people. We are so mythicized in such a small percentage that when they do meet somebody who is like me, I'm a member of the Navajo Nation, they say, well, you're not really Native American. And they just write that completely off, right? So I think that's what it is. They have this idea in their head of what a Native American is. And when they meet somebody who isn't that stereotypical thing that they see in media and they've seen in their mind's eye, they say, well, you're kind of not really that thing that you're okay, like, but you're not real Native American. And so it gets, I really truly believe we're one of the most mythic ethnicities, races, racialized peoples out there, because we fall into this space between blackness and whiteness. Like there's no one skin tone for Native American and indigenous people.
I mean, think about it. But think about it for a moment. And then I'll wrap us up because we've gone for more than 2 hours today and we should probably wrap up soon. But think about it for a moment, is that you are a member of people who were literally the stereotype of the noble savage for the creation of Western social contract theory. So, I mean, the whole Western system is built on seeing you a certain way, right?
Exactly. And it is. I'm taking some college courses right now, and one of them is a history class, and it is about the fourth one in the past couple of years where I'm seriously struggling with the materials that we're going over because of the whitewashing and the framing of everything, and I've repeatedly brought it up to instructors, and it is what it is. We need more pushback. We need more people to actively resist what is happening and reframe this. And like I said, I think there's going to need to be some sort of bigger movement, both for the United States and for indigenous people, to make any kind of progress. It's not going to happen just by wanting it to, or just by even traditional means, let's say.
Chris, do you think it's just going to take something very desperate, like a lot, just more voices like myself raising these, that there needs to be much more urgent solidarity towards Native Americans, Indigenous Hawaiians, and Indigenous Alaskans?
I mean, we're having this conversation at the end of a show about propaganda because we happen to have an Indigenous person on the show. And to a certain extent, because of his identity that we end up being pulled into certain specific places about how imperialism and the cop propaganda come together. And so I think that, yeah, people have to say things and have conversations and talk to people and think about who they platform, which is my segue into saying you're never going to see me platform Candace Owens to spread anti-Semitic, anti-communist conspiracy theories about how the Bolsheviks killed tens of millions of Christians, which is just, false.
Well, in the immortal, let me just say, in the immortal words of NWA, fuck the police. and fuck the military too. And I'm also tired of people groveling to the ex-military people who are now anti-imperialists. Like, who gives a shit? Like, fuck the military, and they're the police on steroids, and none of this. And even if we did abolish the police overnight, even if we ended the system of imperialism overnight, none of that matters until we give urgent justice to Native Americans, Aboriginal Australians, the Sami people, the Maori people, and Indigenous Canadians, Indigenous Hawaiians, Indigenous Alaskans. As John Pilgers said, none of that is going to change until we right the wrongs of the bloody past. Until we give back their nationhood, we can never claim our own.
Let's also point out, because they fall through the cracks a lot, people in Africa living indigenous lifestyles that are repressed by Western conservationists and African capitalists on both ends.
Yeah.
Seth, do you have any final thoughts for the show for today?
No, the only thing I'll say is that, the thing I think I've come back to is it's going to be really hard with anybody trying to tell a story of policing, considering what policing is, not to fall into propaganda, even the most well-intentioned. And unfortunately, we don't even have that happening. It's not well-intentioned people out there. They're actively pushing the propaganda from the cops' perspective. So it's a real mess. And anybody who engages with that media, hey, you can have fun and engage with it if it's your thing, but understand what it is, know what it is. So that's what I'd say.
And talk about what it is, criticize what it is. If you're consuming that kind of media, then use what you learn from that media to be critical about what it says about the system, even as it tries to uphold the system. Because I laid out the formula again, just to lay out my final thoughts for the show, it follows that same thing for all these cold case reality shows. Step one, the cops investigate the wrong person. Step two, the cops investigate the wrong person, a different wrong person. Step three, the cops give up and spend time investigating whatever lead people bring them. And step four, the cops give up entirely until someone comes along years later and solves it for them. That's the formula for nearly every one of these cold case reality crime shows. Either DNA miraculously works its way through the system years later, or a reporter or a private investigator working for somebody does something that the cops never bothered to do. And why is that? It's because the cops aren't actually there to solve the crimes. They're there to serve the class interests of the people who own property, the landlord, and the boss. We, as workers and peasants, should just sort of keep that in mind in our interactions with the police and in our consumption of the media. I want to thank everybody who's been watching the show. I really enjoy it. I really hope that everybody has a great week this week. And as always, we'll tweet at you.